I always knew it would happen. I knew the first time my husband hit me, I wouldn't be surprised. Maybe that was the worst part, not the bruise, not the sting of his palm against my cheek, but the fact that I had been waiting for it. Every time his jaw clenched, every time his knuckles tightened on the steering wheel or his breath came in shallow spurts, I braced myself. I was like a fisherman waiting for the line to snap, for the tension to finally pull too hard. And it did. At first, it wasn't his hands. It was the words, sharp, cutting, like the cold wind that comes off the lake on a winter morning. The look in his eyes told me I wasn't worth much, not to him, not to anyone. "You're useless," he'd say, usually muttered under his breath when he thought I couldn't hear. But I heard every word. It started with those quiet insults, then came the frustration, the way he treated me like I was something broken, something that couldn't be fixed. He wasn't always like that. In the early days, Frank was rough around the edges, sure, but there was something about him that I thought I could live with. He had that hard, worn look that fishermen get, skin tanned and cracked, hands tough from years of casting lines and hauling in nets. He was steady, back then. Solid. Maybe that's why I married him. I thought I needed someone steady. Someone who could anchor me. But people change. The first real crack in his demeanor came when I bought the wrong bait. He had been planning one of his solo fishing trips, the kind where he'd leave me behind for a few days. I picked up the wrong kind of bait from the tackle shop, and when I brought it home, his face went dark. I could see the anger boiling just under the surface. "You never get anything right," he muttered, staring at the container in my hand like it had personally offended him. I opened my mouth to apologize, but the words caught in my throat. He didn't scream. He didn't yell. Instead, he punched a hole in the wall right next to my head. His fist went straight through the plaster, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at the jagged opening, wide like the gaping mouth of a fish struggling for air. The room went silent, save for the soft sound of dust settling. I knew then that it wasn't about the bait. It never had been. For days, the hole in the wall sat there, untouched, a constant reminder of what was to come. I couldn't stop looking at it. I knew I'd be next. My skin would be the thing he shattered next time. I was the one left to patch it up either with my own hands or with what little money we had left after he drank away his paycheck. He never apologized for that moment. He didn't even acknowledge it. The hole in the wall wasn't a mistake to him. It was just part of life. Part of our life. And so was the anger that came with it. That night, he still drank the wrong bait beer I'd bought for him. The irony didn't escape me. He didn't care what it was, so long as it numbed him. It wasn't long after that when the wall was no longer enough to satisfy his temper. His fist found me next, just like I knew it would. It came one night after he'd gotten back from the lake, drunk and frustrated. He swayed in the doorway of our little cabin, muttering about how the fish weren't biting, how the water was too rough, and how it was all my fault. I stayed silent, as I always did, but my quiet didn't calm him this time. It only made him angrier. "You just sit there, don't you?" he growled, taking a few staggering steps toward me. "You don't do anything. You don't say anything." Before I could move, his hand swung out, catching me across the cheek. It wasn't the hardest hit, it wasn't the worst pain I'd ever felt, but it broke something inside me. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. I had been expecting it for so long that when it finally happened, all I could feel was relief. The tension in the line had snapped, and now I was free. But I wasn't. The hit wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. I didn't fight back. I didn't scream. I just stood there, staring at him as my skin burned from the impact, knowing that this was my life now. The perfect cracks in the walls, the small bruises he'd leave behind, those were just the marks of a life lived in silence. I wasn't afraid of him. Not anymore. Fear was something you felt before the impact, not after. I just didn't know how far the cracks would spread. Not yet. Looking back, I realize now that love was never part of the equation. My marriage to Frank wasn't some fairy tale romance, nor was it built on passion or mutual respect. No, it was born out of something far more primal, desperation. I didn't marry him because I loved him, I married him because I needed him. And I think, deep down, he knew that too. I grew up in a small fishing town where opportunities were as scarce as calm seas in a storm. My family was poor, dirt poor. I was one of 7 kids, and as the middle child, I slipped through the cracks, barely noticed most of the time. My parents struggled just to keep food on the table, let alone provide for all of us. By the time I hit my teenage years, it was clear to me that I needed to find a way out. That's where Frank came in. We met at the dock where he worked, fixing up boats and maintaining fishing gear. He wasn't exactly charming or handsome, far from it. Frank had the look of a man who had seen too many rough days. His skin was sun-worn and leathery, his hands calloused from years of hard work. There was nothing soft about him, nothing inviting. But I didn't care about that. I cared that he had a steady job and a place of his own. That was all I needed. My father had nearly totaled his old boat one afternoon, and Frank was the one who fixed it up. I went with him to the dock that day, and it was there, standing among the scent of salt water and fish, that I saw my opportunity. Frank wasn't like the other men in town. Those men had families, girlfriends, lives that were too full for someone like me to slip into. But Frank? He was alone, just like me. He was practical. And I knew I could make that work. We got married not long after I graduated high school. There wasn't a big ceremony, no frills or fuss. We stood in a tiny chapel on the edge of town, our families barely filling the pews. His side of the chapel was nearly empty. My side, well, my parents couldn't afford to take time off from their shifts, so they didn't bother to come. The few guests that did show up weren't there for the celebration. They were there out of obligation, out of curiosity about the poor girl who'd managed to marry a man with a steady income. The ceremony itself was quick. The kiss we shared tasted like gas station snacks and stale beer. I remember the feeling of his rough hands as they held mine, and the way his dark eyes seemed hollow even then. But I didn't care. I had done what I set out to do. I had escaped the suffocating life I'd grown up in, trading one form of desperation for another. In the beginning, it wasn't all bad. The small lakefront shack we moved into was a step up from the cramped, rotting house I grew up in. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was ours. Frank spent most of his days out on the water, fishing or working on boats, and I picked up a part-time job at the local bait shop. Life fell into a rhythm. He'd come home tired and smelling like fish, and I'd make dinner, clean up, and go to bed. It was simple. Monotonous, even. But that was better than the chaos I'd come from. We barely talked in those early years. Frank wasn't much of a conversationalist. He'd grunt his way through most of our interactions, content to sit in silence after a long day on the lake. I didn't mind it at first. Silence was better than the shouting matches I'd grown up with. I'd tell myself that this was enough, that this quiet life with Frank was better than struggling alone. At least I wasn't cold, hungry, or living with my parents anymore. But as the months dragged on, the cracks began to show. Frank's temper, which I had seen flashes of during our time together, started to flare more often. Small things set him off, the house not being clean enough, dinner being late, or the fish not biting when he went out. He'd mutter under his breath, his frustration simmering just below the surface. And every time, I told myself it wasn't a big deal. After all, life had hardened both of us in different ways. We were just two people trying to survive. The real trouble started when we tried for a child. Frank had always wanted a son to take out on the boat, to teach how to fish and repair engines. I went along with it, not because I wanted a family with him, but because it seemed like the next logical step. But after months of trying and failing, we saw a doctor. I'll never forget the look on Frank's face when we were told I couldn't have children. It was like I had failed him in the most profound way possible. From that moment on, everything changed. Whatever affection or tolerance he had for me vanished. I was no longer the woman he married. I was something broken, defective, a reminder of what he would never have. He made sure to tell me that often, usually after a few too many drinks. "You can't even give me a kid," he'd say, his words slurred and bitter. "What good are you?" I stayed silent, as I always did. I couldn't leave him, not financially, and not emotionally. I had nowhere to go, and the idea of starting over was even more terrifying than staying. So, I stayed. We drifted further apart, two strangers bound together by a marriage that had never been about love. The quiet life I had once thought was enough slowly turned into a prison, with Frank's anger becoming the bars that held me in place. And just like that, the desperation I thought I had escaped came creeping back. It didn't happen all at once, but looking back, I can see the shift as clearly as the turning of the tides. Frank's temper had always been there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was contained, manageable. He'd mutter, throw a look my way, maybe slam a door, but that was the extent of it. Then came the news from the doctor. That's when everything changed. The moment I was told I couldn't have children, it was like something inside him snapped, something vital. I had felt relief when the doctor gave us the news. It wasn't that I didn't want kids, but I had known deep down that bringing a child into our world would be a mistake. How could I raise a child in a house full of tension, anger, and silence? How could I let my child watch their father tear into me day after day, knowing one day he might do the same to them? The idea of protecting a child from him was a burden I wasn't ready to carry. But Frank didn't see it that way. To him, the news wasn't just a medical fact, it was my fault. He had been trying for a son, someone to carry on his legacy, to fish by his side, and I had failed him in the worst way possible. He didn't say it outright at first, but the blame seeped into his every word, his every action. He couldn't hide the resentment that began building inside him, and it soon spilled over into our day-to-day lives. Little things set him off. If dinner was 5 minutes late, if I didn't scrub the dishes clean enough, if I forgot to pick up something he needed from the bait shop, everything became a trigger for his temper. He started throwing things, plates, glasses, anything within reach. The sounds of breaking objects became as common in our home as the quiet lapping of the lake outside. He never apologized. Never even acknowledged the mess he made. That was my job. To clean up after him, to make it right, to keep the peace. But the peace never lasted long. More and more, Frank turned to the bottle. He had always been a drinker, sure. Most of the men in town were. But there's a difference between having a beer after a long day on the water and drowning yourself in alcohol just to make it through the night. He started coming home with cheap bottles of whiskey and rum, the kind that left his breath reeking for days, the kind that fueled his growing anger. I began to dread the nights when he would stumble in late, his heavy footsteps thudding against the wooden floor, the door slamming behind him. I'd know from the way he fumbled with his keys that it was going to be a bad night. There was always that 1 second of silence, the calm before the storm, when I'd hear him drop his keys onto the table, followed by the sound of the bottle being uncapped. I'd sit frozen in the kitchen, my hands gripping the edge of the counter, waiting for it to begin. First came the grumbling, angry mutterings about how nothing in his life had gone the way it should have. Then, without fail, he'd stumble into the kitchen or the living room, wherever I was, and find something to pick apart. "You can't even cook a damn meal right," he'd say, staring at the half-eaten plate of food I'd left for him. "You can't do anything right, can you?" I'd stare at the floor, my eyes tracing the cracks in the wooden planks. There was no point in answering. No point in defending myself. That only ever made things worse. Silence was my defense, but even that wasn't enough to keep him at bay. The blame for our inability to have children was never far from his mind. He'd throw it in my face at every opportunity, whether it made sense or not. I couldn't control the fish in the lake, I couldn't control the weather, and I couldn't give him the son he so desperately wanted. "I wasted my best years on you," he'd say. "And for what? A broken woman who can't even have kids." He didn't just say it when he was drunk either. Sometimes, in the middle of the day, when he was supposed to be out on the lake, he'd come home early. I'd hear his boots on the porch, and the door would fly open with a crash. His eyes would be bloodshot, his face twisted in anger. "You're the reason I'm stuck in this hellhole," he'd say, gesturing to the lake and the small shack we called home. "You're the reason my life is nothing." Those words cut deeper than the insults about my cooking or cleaning. He blamed me for everything: his failed fishing trips, the bad weather, the lack of children. It didn't matter that I had no control over any of it. To him, I was the reason his life hadn't turned out the way he wanted, and he made sure I knew it. The drinking only made things worse. He'd stumble in late at night, reeking of alcohol and bad decisions, and the yelling would start all over again. Sometimes he'd throw things, other times he'd get close, his face inches from mine, daring me to push back. But I never did. I stayed silent, like always, waiting for the storm to pass. But it never did. It just kept getting worse, his temper flaring more often, the distance between us growing wider with every bottle he emptied. And every time I cleaned up the mess he left behind, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer it would be before that anger, that blame, turned into something more. I could feel it coming, like a storm brewing on the horizon. I knew it was only a matter of time before the next crack in our fragile life together shattered everything for good. The first dream came after a particularly bad night. Frank had stumbled in late, reeking of whiskey and anger, and the fight that followed had been worse than usual. He didn't hit me, he hadn't done that yet, but the way he yelled, the venom in his words, made it clear he was getting closer. I could see it in his eyes, feel it in the tension that filled the room. It was like the air around him crackled with the potential for violence. That night, after cleaning up the shattered remains of a plate he'd thrown against the wall, I went to bed with my heart pounding in my chest. My mind was still racing, trying to make sense of everything. But as soon as I closed my eyes, sleep took me, pulling me under like the dark waters of the lake just outside our door. In the dream, I stood on the shore of the lake, the water as still as glass. There was something eerie about the way it reflected the moonlight, perfectly calm, almost too calm. I knew something was wrong. The air was thick with tension, the kind you feel just before a storm. I couldn't see the storm, but I could feel it, heavy and oppressive, hanging in the sky just out of sight. I wasn't alone. At first, I thought I was just imagining it, the feeling of something watching me. But as I looked out over the water, I saw movement beneath the surface. A ripple, faint but undeniable. Something was down there, lurking in the depths, and it was getting closer. I took a step back, my feet sinking into the wet sand as I watched the water start to churn. The ripple grew larger, spreading out in all directions, until finally, something broke the surface. It wasn't a fish. It was a creature, dark and twisted, rising slowly from the lake as if it had been waiting there for me all along. Its body was long and sinuous, with pale, slimy skin that glistened in the moonlight. Its arms were too long, the fingers ending in sharp, claw-like tips. But it was its face, or what passed for a face, that filled me with a strange, cold terror. It didn't have eyes, just two dark, empty sockets that seemed to stare right through me. Its mouth stretched wide, far too wide, filled with jagged teeth that gleamed like wet stones. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. As if it knew I wasn't going anywhere. And the worst part? I wasn't afraid of it. I should have been, but I wasn't. Instead, I felt a strange sense of recognition, like I had seen it before. Like I knew it. The creature stopped at the edge of the water, its long, spindly fingers digging into the sand. It tilted its head, its empty sockets locked onto me, and for a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. I felt my heart racing in my chest, but it wasn't fear that gripped me, it was something else. Something darker. Something familiar. The creature didn't speak, but I understood it. I could feel the rage radiating from it, the helplessness, the cold, burning anger that had been buried deep beneath the surface for far too long. It was my anger, my rage. The things I had kept inside, locked away, because I had no other choice. The things I couldn't say, couldn't feel, because if I did, I wasn't sure I'd survive them. This creature, it was me. I woke up with a jolt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was dark, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming. The image of the creature lingered in my mind, so vivid, so real. I could still feel its presence, like it had followed me out of the dream and into the waking world. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't feel scared. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Like something inside me had shifted. That was the first of many dreams. They came every night after that, each one more intense than the last. The lake was always there, always still and dark, waiting for me. And the creature, it was always there too, watching me from just beneath the surface, waiting to emerge. Sometimes it would crawl out of the water and stand beside me on the shore. Other times, it would simply drift beneath the waves, its dark eyes never leaving mine. In each dream, the creature grew more defined, more real. Its face became clearer, its movements more deliberate. And every time I saw it, I felt that same strange connection, that same sense that it was a part of me, something I had created, something that had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface. During the day, I tried to push the dreams out of my mind. I told myself they were just nightmares, just the product of stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew they were more than that. The dreams weren't just dreams, they were a reflection of something darker, something I didn't want to admit. The creature was my rage, my helplessness, given form. It was everything I had kept bottled up, everything I had never allowed myself to feel. And now, it was rising to the surface, just like the creature in the lake. As the days went on, I found myself thinking about the creature more and more. It became a strange comfort, something to hold onto in the chaos of my life with Frank. Whenever he yelled, whenever he threw something in a drunken rage, I would picture the creature, rising from the water, its dark eyes locking onto mine. I would imagine it standing behind me, watching, waiting. And I would feel a strange sense of power, a power I had never felt before. The creature was a part of me now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was trying to tell me something. Something important. Something that I was too afraid to acknowledge. But I knew, deep down, that one day, I would have to listen. The more Frank's anger grew, the more I found myself retreating into my own mind, into that quiet, dark space where my thoughts could roam free. I didn't realize it at first, but something inside me had begun to change. I was no longer the passive, silent woman I had trained myself to be. Beneath the surface, something darker was stirring, something that was no longer content to just take the abuse and hide in the shadows. It started with small things, tiny flashes of anger that flared up in my mind when Frank would yell or throw something in one of his drunken fits. I'd see myself grabbing the nearest object and smashing it over his head. I'd imagine the look of surprise on his face as I finally stood up to him, as I finally fought back. But those thoughts would come and go, fleeting and easy to dismiss. I'd shake them off, tell myself they were just fantasies, and try to go back to my routine. But then the dreams began to change. At first, the creature from the lake simply watched me in my dreams, lurking in the shadows of the water, waiting. But as Frank's temper worsened, so did the intensity of the dreams. The creature no longer stayed at the edge of the lake. It began to move closer, crawling out of the water, dripping with dark, slimy liquid as it came toward me. And instead of standing passively by my side, it started to take action. In the dreams, I would watch as the creature mirrored the thoughts I kept buried deep inside me, the thoughts of revenge, of violence, of finally giving Frank what he deserved. The first time it happened, I stood frozen in my dream, watching as the creature crawled up onto the shore and walked into our home. It didn't hesitate. It moved with purpose, its long, spindly fingers flexing with anticipation as it approached Frank. He was sitting in his chair, drunk and mumbling to himself, unaware of what was coming. I watched as the creature circled behind him, its empty sockets locked onto him with cold precision. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it reached out, wrapping its fingers around his neck. Frank's body jerked, his eyes wide with shock, but no sound came from his mouth. The creature tightened its grip, squeezing until his face turned a deep shade of purple, his veins bulging against his skin. I didn't move. I didn't try to stop it. I just stood there, watching as the creature did what I had only ever dreamed of doing. There was no guilt, no fear, only a deep, overwhelming satisfaction. I woke up with a start, my heart racing, but the adrenaline didn't fade like it usually did after a nightmare. Instead, I felt strangely calm, like a weight had been lifted from my chest. I sat up in bed, the image of the creature strangling Frank still vivid in my mind. It didn't scare me. It thrilled me. For the first time in years, I felt powerful, even if it was only in my dreams. The dreams continued, and each one grew more violent, more vivid. Every night, the creature would find new ways to hurt Frank, new ways to make him pay for every bruise, every insult, every moment of humiliation I had endured. Sometimes it would hold him underwater until he stopped thrashing, the bubbles rising slowly to the surface of the lake. Other times, it would drag him into the darkness of the forest, its claws tearing into his flesh, silencing his screams. And I was always there, watching. Not as a victim, but as a silent accomplice. I never lifted a finger in the dreams, but I didn't need to. The creature was my anger, my hatred, given form. It did the things I could never do, but desperately wanted to. And the more I dreamed, the more I realized that I was no longer afraid of Frank. I wasn't afraid of his fists, of his yelling, of the violent outbursts that had once sent me cowering in the corner. Because now, I had something he didn't, a sense of control. It might have only been in my dreams, but that didn't matter. The creature was a part of me, and every night, I fed it with my rage, letting it grow stronger. Letting it become more real. I began to look forward to the dreams, even crave them. They were an escape, a release from the suffocating reality of my life with Frank. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that familiar pull, dragging me back to the lake, back to the creature that waited for me. It never spoke, but it didn't need to. We understood each other. We were one and the same. During the day, I kept my usual routine. I was the perfect wife, doing everything I could to keep the peace, to avoid setting Frank off. But even as I cleaned up the broken dishes or wiped away the evidence of his anger, I knew I wasn't truly powerless anymore. I knew that when the night came, the creature would be waiting for me, ready to carry out the revenge I dreamed of. Frank had no idea, of course. To him, I was still the same quiet, broken woman he had always known. He had no idea that, in my mind, I had already watched him die 100 times over. He didn't know that every time he raised his voice, I pictured the creature standing behind him, ready to strike. The fantasies began to creep into my waking life. I'd catch myself daydreaming about it, the image of the creature flashing in my mind when Frank would get angry or start throwing things. I would imagine it appearing behind him, its long, pale arms wrapping around his throat, silencing him for good. The thought made me smile, and for once, I didn't feel guilty about it. I wasn't sure how much longer I could live like this, balancing between the world of dreams and reality, where the only place I had any real power was in my own mind. But I knew one thing for certain, the creature was getting stronger. And one day, it wouldn't just stay in my dreams. One day, it would break free. It was late when Frank came home that night, later than usual, and even before he stumbled through the door, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, thick and oppressive, like the suffocating heat before a summer storm. I had been lying in bed, trying to sleep, but as the hours stretched on, I couldn't shake the sense of unease creeping into my bones. When I heard the door slam, I knew it wasn't just the alcohol this time. The footsteps that followed were uneven, heavier than usual, each one sending a jolt of anxiety straight through me. I stayed perfectly still, my breath shallow, listening. His movements were clumsy, and the strange grunts he made under his breath didn't sound like his usual drunken mumblings. There was something more animalistic about it, more unhinged. I heard him banging through the hallway, knocking over furniture as he made his way toward the bedroom. When he finally shoved the door open, I could see it in his eyes. He was high. His pupils were blown wide, dark pits that swallowed the light, and there was a wildness in his gaze that I hadn't seen before. His body swayed as if he were trying to hold himself up by sheer force of will, but his mind was long gone. "Get up," he snarled, his voice thick and slurred. "I need to talk to you." I didn't move, hoping that maybe if I stayed still, if I stayed quiet, he would give up and leave me alone. But Frank wasn't having it. He lunged forward, grabbing my arm and yanking me out of bed with more force than he'd ever used before. I barely had time to catch myself as I stumbled, the pain shooting through my wrist where his fingers dug in. "What the hell are you doing?" I gasped, my voice trembling despite my attempt to keep calm. "You're hurting me, Frank." He didn't seem to hear me. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, and there was spit at the corner of his mouth. The scent of booze clung to him, but there was something else in the air, a chemical stench that made my stomach turn. He was high on something stronger than alcohol, something that had wiped away any semblance of the man I used to know. "You think you can just ignore me?" he spat, his voice rising. "You think you're better than me? You're nothing. You hear me? You're nothing." I tried to pull away, to put some distance between us, but he wouldn't let go. His grip tightened, his nails biting into my skin. And then, without warning, he slapped me. The force of it knocked me off balance, and I hit the floor hard, the impact rattling my bones. My vision blurred for a moment, stars dancing in the corners of my eyes. I knew I had to get out of there. I scrambled backward, my palms scraping against the wooden floor as I tried to put space between us. But Frank was faster than I expected. He grabbed me again, dragging me up by my shirt, his breath hot and reeking of whatever poison was coursing through his veins. "I'm gonna kill you," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "I'm done with you." Something snapped inside me then, something that had been building for years. I wasn't going to die here. Not like this. I pushed him as hard as I could, my palms slamming into his chest. He staggered back, caught off guard, and for a brief moment, I thought I had a chance to get away. But then he regained his footing, his face twisted in rage. He lunged at me again, wild and furious, but in his frenzy, he tripped over the corner of the rug. It wasn't much, but it was enough to throw him off balance. He slammed into the dresser, knocking the mirror off the wall. The glass shattered on impact, raining down around us like jagged pieces of ice. I tried to run, but before I could move, he grabbed one of the shards. I froze. Frank's face was a mask of unbridled fury, and for the first time, I saw pure hatred in his eyes. His pupils were still wide, black voids, but behind them, there was a different kind of madness now. His hands were shaking, the shard of glass trembling in his grip, but he didn't seem to care. "I'll kill you," he whispered again, almost like a promise. I didn't think, I just acted. In a moment of pure instinct, I shoved him hard, knocking him off balance. He stumbled back, and as he did, I tripped over the edge of the bed, my body twisting awkwardly. My head slammed into the edge of the nightstand with a sickening crack, and the world went dark. For a while, there was nothing. No sound, no feeling, just an empty void where my thoughts should have been. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the silence. My ears were ringing, my head pounding, but everything else was still. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, and slowly, the room came into focus. The floor was cold beneath me, sticky with something wet. My body ached, and when I touched the back of my head, my fingers came away slick with blood. But I wasn't alone. I looked up, and there it was, the creature from my dreams. It stood at the foot of the bed, tall and looming, its pale, spindly body covered in dark stains. Its head was cocked to the side, those familiar black sockets staring at me, as if waiting for something. This couldn't be real. I had to still be dreaming. But the pain was real. The blood was real. And the creature, it was real, too. My heart raced as I stared at it, unsure if I should move, if I should run, if I should even breathe. But the creature didn't come for me. It didn't attack. Instead, it turned its head, slowly, deliberately, toward the other side of the room. Toward Frank. Frank was lying on the floor, unconscious, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The shard of glass was still clutched in his hand, but his grip had loosened. He looked so small, so weak now, like a man who had spent all his strength in one final burst of rage. The creature watched him, its body still as it observed him with a cold detachment. And then it moved. I watched, unable to do anything, as the creature crawled forward, its long limbs bending at unnatural angles. It was slow, deliberate, like a predator approaching wounded prey. The sound of its claws scraping against the floor sent chills down my spine, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. This wasn't a dream. This was happening. The line between my dreams and reality had blurred, and the creature, the thing I had created in my mind, was here. It was real. And it was going to finish what I couldn't. I wanted to stop it. I wanted to call out, to scream, to tell it to stop. But as I lay there, watching the creature approach Frank, I realized something terrible. I didn't want to stop it. Not anymore. I woke up slowly, the pounding in my head making it hard to focus. My body felt heavy, weighted down by exhaustion and pain. The last thing I remembered was hitting my head, the blinding flash of pain as my skull cracked against the nightstand, and then darkness. But the darkness hadn't swallowed me completely. I blinked against the light filtering through the window, squinting as the room came into focus. At first, nothing seemed different. The shattered mirrors still lay scattered across the floor, glistening in the morning sun like jagged pieces of ice. My body ached all over, my skin bruised and my head throbbing. I could feel the sticky warmth of blood at the back of my scalp, where I had fallen. Then I saw it. Standing over Frank's unconscious body, just like in my dreams, was the creature. The thing I thought only existed in the twisted, violent fantasies of my mind. The thing that had haunted me for weeks, slipping into my sleep, feeding on my rage. Except now, it wasn't in my dreams anymore. It was here. I should have screamed. My body should have recoiled in terror at the sight of it, tall and hunched, with its long, sinewy limbs and pale, slick skin. Its face, or what passed for one, was exactly as I had imagined, eyeless, with only two deep, black sockets where its eyes should have been, and a wide, tooth-filled grin that stretched unnervingly across its elongated face. The creature loomed over Frank, motionless, as if waiting for my next move. My breath caught in my throat as I struggled to make sense of it. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that this was just some lingering effect of the head injury or another vivid dream. But the pain was too real, the throbbing in my head too sharp. The glass on the floor, the blood on my hands, it was all real. And so was the creature. I felt an overwhelming sense of recognition, as if I had seen this moment before. I had. Night after night, I had watched this creature in my dreams, watched as it enacted the revenge I had only fantasized about, watched as it did what I couldn't bring myself to do. But now, as I lay there, staring at the thing that had crawled out of my nightmares, I realized something that sent a chill through me. It wasn't just a part of my dreams. It wasn't just some twisted fantasy I had conjured in the dead of night. This thing, this creature, was a part of me. An extension of my fury, my pain, my helplessness. It had been growing inside me for weeks, maybe longer, feeding off my anger, my hatred, and now, it was here. And I was in control. I slowly pushed myself up from the floor, my legs trembling beneath me as I stood. The creature didn't move. It remained where it was, crouched low over Frank's still form, its head tilted slightly, like it was listening, waiting. My heart pounded in my chest, but I wasn't afraid of it. I wasn't afraid of me. I took a step forward, my feet crunching over the broken glass. The creature's head turned slowly toward me, those empty, black sockets locking onto mine. It didn't lunge. It didn't snarl or threaten me. It simply watched, its long, bony fingers flexing as it waited for my command. I raised a hand, unsure of what I was doing, but the moment I moved, the creature mirrored me. Its long, clawed hand rose in the same motion, following my lead. I took another step forward, and the creature shifted, its posture changing as it moved in time with me, as though we were bound together by something deeper than I could comprehend. My heart raced, but not from fear. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of control, a sense of power that I had never known before. This creature, it was me. It was all the things I had buried inside, all the anger I had kept locked away, all the violent thoughts I had been too afraid to act on. It was the part of me I had always been too weak to embrace. But now, there was no running from it. There was no hiding from what I had become. I looked down at Frank. He was unconscious, lying in a heap on the floor, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. His face was bruised, his lip split, and the shard of glass he had wielded earlier had slipped from his hand. He looked so small now, so helpless. All the rage, the control he had once held over me, was gone. And in its place, I stood victorious, no longer a victim of his abuse, no longer the woman he had torn apart piece by piece. The creature tilted its head, watching me closely, as if waiting for my next command. I knew, deep down, that I could do anything I wanted now. I could finish what I had started in my dreams. I could give Frank what he deserved, what I had longed for him to feel all those years he had hurt me. I could make him suffer in ways that only the creature and I understood. But instead, I stood there, breathing heavily, the adrenaline surging through my veins. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. Because I knew that I was in control. And for now, that was enough. The creature slowly straightened, its tall frame towering over Frank, but it didn't attack. It didn't move to hurt him. It simply stood by my side, watching me, waiting for my command. I had dreamed of this moment for so long, the moment when I could finally take back the power I had lost. But now that it was here, I realized something else. I didn't need to kill Frank to win. I didn't need to become the monster he had always been. Because I already had the upper hand. I already had what I needed. I turned away from Frank, leaving him there, unconscious and bleeding, while the creature followed me. As I walked toward the door, I could feel its presence, a constant, steady force by my side. It was no longer something to fear, no longer a part of me I needed to hide or deny. It was me, fully and completely. And together, we were unstoppable. Frank was still breathing when I stepped outside, the cool morning air filling my lungs. The sun was just beginning to rise over the lake, casting long shadows across the water, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel afraid. The creature lingered in the doorway behind me, its pale, monstrous form blending into the shadows. I didn't need to look back to know it was there. I could feel it, always with me, always ready. And from that moment on, I knew that I would never be powerless again. The days that followed felt like a blur, but unlike before, I wasn't moving through life in a fog. There was clarity in my mind now, clarity that I hadn't had in years. Everything seemed sharper, more focused. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was plotting, planning, waiting for the perfect moment. I spent hours thinking about how it would happen. I imagined the look on Frank's face when he realized he wasn't in control anymore, that the tables had turned, and that I was no longer the meek woman he thought he could break. The creature and I were one now, our bond sealed in that moment of recognition. It was no longer just a figment of my dreams, but a real, tangible force that moved with me, mirrored me, and would do whatever I commanded. At first, Frank didn't notice the change. He woke up bruised and disoriented after the fight, muttering curses as he nursed his wounds, but he didn't ask any questions. Maybe he couldn't remember what had happened in his drugged-up haze, or maybe he was too proud to admit that I'd gotten the upper hand. Either way, he didn't know that the creature had been standing over him, watching, waiting for me to give the order to end him. But I hadn't. Not yet. Instead, I kept playing the part of the obedient wife, moving through our crumbling house with a sense of purpose that Frank didn't notice. I cleaned, I cooked, I did what was expected of me, all while keeping my eyes on him, biding my time. Every time he snapped at me, every time he threw something in my direction or muttered about how worthless I was, I felt the creature stir inside me. It was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for my signal. I could feel it in the way my body responded. Every movement I made, every thought I had, the creature mirrored. When I raised a hand to wipe the table, it would lift its own pale, clawed hand in the same motion, hovering just outside of my line of sight. When I walked across the floor, I could feel its silent footsteps moving in tandem with mine. It was no longer separate from me, it was an extension of my very being, and that gave me a sense of power that I had never felt before. I started planning Frank's downfall carefully, deliberately. I thought about all the ways I could make him suffer, about how long I could draw it out, how I could repay him for the years of pain he had inflicted on me. But as much as I wanted to hurt him, I wanted something more than that. I wanted him to know, without a doubt, that this was my doing. That I was the one in control now. The creature knew this too. Every night, when I lay in bed, it would come to me, crouching in the corner of the room, its eyeless face turned toward me, waiting. And every night, I would imagine the moment when I would finally set it loose, when I would unleash it on Frank and let it do what it had been waiting to do all along. The night came sooner than I expected. Frank had been out drinking, as usual, stumbling home in the early hours of the morning, stinking of whiskey and rage. He slammed the door as he came in, muttering something incoherent under his breath. I was in the kitchen, pretending to clean up from dinner, though my mind was miles ahead, planning every detail of what was about to happen. "You think you can just ignore me?" Frank growled, stumbling into the room. "You think I don't see you standing there, acting like you're better than me?" I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The creature was already there, moving in the shadows, waiting for me to give it the signal. Frank grabbed a chair and threw it against the wall, the wood splintering on impact. His anger was familiar, predictable, but this time, I didn't flinch. I didn't shrink away. I just stood there, watching him, my heart pounding with anticipation. The creature loomed behind me, tall and menacing, its pale skin gleaming in the faint light of the room. It was ready. "You worthless piece of," Frank started, but he didn't get to finish. I moved first. With a calmness that surprised even me, I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. The creature mirrored my movement perfectly, its long, clawed fingers reaching out as I did, ready to strike. I could feel the rage building inside me, the years of abuse bubbling to the surface, and this time, I didn't hold it back. In one swift motion, I shoved Frank hard. He stumbled back, caught off guard, but before he could react, the creature was on him. It moved with a speed and precision that took my breath away, its long arms wrapping around Frank's body, pinning him to the floor with an inhuman strength. Frank thrashed, his eyes wide with shock, but there was nothing he could do. The creature held him down, its fingers digging into his skin, drawing blood with every movement. For a moment, I just stood there, watching. Watching as the man who had terrorized me for years finally realized that he wasn't in control anymore. Watching as the creature tightened its grip, its long, spindly fingers curling around his throat, cutting off his air. Frank gasped, his face turning red, but there was no fight left in him. Not now. I crouched down beside him, my face inches from his, and for the first time in years, I smiled. "I'm done being afraid of you," I whispered, my voice steady, cold. "You're nothing to me now." Frank's eyes widened, his mouth opening in a silent plea for mercy, but there was none to give. I had waited too long for this moment, and now that it was here, I wasn't going to let it slip away. The creature mirrored me, its wide, tooth-filled grin stretching across its monstrous face as it tightened its grip on Frank's throat. I could hear the gurgling sound as Frank struggled to breathe, his body thrashing beneath the weight of the creature, but there was no escape. Not this time. I stood up slowly, letting the creature do what I had dreamed of for so long. It moved with a deadly grace, every motion precise and deliberate, as if it had been practicing this moment for years. And in a way, it had. It was the embodiment of everything I had ever felt, all the anger, the pain, the helplessness, and now, it was exacting my revenge. As the life drained out of Frank, I felt nothing but a sense of calm. There was no guilt, no fear. Only the quiet satisfaction that justice had been served. When it was done, the creature stood beside me, its body still and silent, like a shadow cast by the fading light. Frank lay on the floor, his eyes wide and empty, his body still. The house was quiet now, peaceful. I didn't look back as I walked out the door, the creature following me like an obedient companion. Together, we left the house, stepping into the cool night air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was free. The lake shimmered in the distance, its surface calm and still, just as it had been in my dreams. And as I stood there, staring out at the water, I knew that the creature and I would never be separated again. It was a part of me now, a part of my strength, my power. Together, we would face whatever came next. The lake was calm that night, the surface so still it looked like glass. I stood at the edge, the moonlight reflecting off the water in ripples as I watched the dark shape of Frank's body sink into the depths. The creature moved beside me, its presence as silent as the night, and together we waited until he disappeared completely. I hadn't hesitated when it came time to dispose of him. The lake had always been Frank's domain, his escape when he wanted to get away from me, from life, from his own failures. He'd spend hours out there, fishing and drinking, coming back with that same foul temper that never left him. But now, it was my turn to make the lake mine. As the last bubbles rose from the water, marking the final traces of his body's descent, I felt a strange sense of relief, a weight lifting from my chest. Frank was gone, and with him, the years of anger, fear, and abuse. I was no longer trapped in that suffocating house, no longer waiting for his next outburst or trying to keep myself small and unseen to avoid his wrath. The lake had taken him, swallowed him whole, and now it was just me. Just me and the creature. I knelt by the water's edge, dipping my fingers into the cool liquid. The sensation was soothing, like the lake was welcoming me, calling me to stay. There had been a time when this place filled me with dread, when I saw the lake as a mirror of my own isolation, its cold depths a reflection of the prison I lived in with Frank. But now, as I looked out over the water, I felt nothing but peace. This place, once a symbol of my fear, had become my sanctuary. The creature stood silently beside me, its long limbs slightly hunched, as if waiting for my next move. It no longer frightened me, no longer seemed like a monster born from my nightmares. It was a part of me now, an extension of my fury and my strength. In the moonlight, its pale, sinewy body seemed almost graceful, its movements fluid and precise. It had been my protector when I couldn't protect myself, and now, it was the only thing left that truly understood me. I glanced at the water again, watching the surface smooth out, erasing the last traces of what I had done. Frank was gone. His body would never be found. The lake would keep its secret, just as I would. There was a power in that knowledge, a kind of freedom I had never known before. I had always been so powerless, so helpless under Frank's control. But now, with him gone, I felt more alive than ever. But the freedom wasn't pure. It came with a heavy truth. As much as I felt liberated, as much as the lake had become my sanctuary, I knew I couldn't stay. I rose from my crouched position, staring out at the water, the wind cool against my face. The house behind me, the life I'd once had, was no longer mine. I had no future there. Too many ghosts lingered in the rooms where Frank had yelled, where I had silently endured his cruelty. Even now, the quiet of the lake couldn't erase the memories of the bruises, the broken dishes, and the shattered woman I had once been. The creature seemed to sense my thoughts. It moved closer, its shadow merging with mine as it mirrored my every motion. I could feel its silent encouragement, its wordless agreement. This place, this town, it had never been mine. It had always been his, and now that he was gone, there was nothing left for me here. I couldn't stay, not with the questions that would eventually come. Not with the weight of what I had done clinging to every step I took. The lake had taken Frank, but it couldn't take me. I had to go. Somewhere far from here, somewhere new. I didn't know where yet, but the thought of leaving didn't scare me. Not like it would have before. I was no longer the woman who had tiptoed around her husband, afraid of his fists, his words, his constant simmering rage. I was someone else now, someone who had faced the darkest part of herself and come out the other side. The creature had shown me that. It had made me see what I was truly capable of. I looked back at the water one last time. The lake, once my prison, had become my freedom. But it was a freedom I couldn't fully embrace. Not here. Not in the place that had once held me captive. The creature moved with me as I turned away from the shore, its presence as steady as my own shadow. Together, we walked back toward the house, the wooden boards creaking under our feet. The rooms inside were dark and cold, but I didn't fear them anymore. I wasn't afraid of anything anymore. I packed a small bag, just the essentials. I wouldn't need much. I wouldn't be staying long enough to worry about what I was leaving behind. As I stepped outside for the final time, I didn't look back. The house, the lake, the memories, they were behind me now. I had new horizons ahead, and though I didn't know where they would lead, I knew I wouldn't be facing them alone. The creature, my dark reflection, would be with me every step of the way. The road stretched out before me, winding through the trees, disappearing into the distance. I could feel the pull of the unknown, the thrill of escape, of starting over. And with every step I took, the sense of freedom grew stronger. The road ahead stretched out like an endless ribbon of possibility, winding through the dark trees, disappearing into the unknown. I didn't have a destination in mind, but that didn't matter. All I knew was that I was moving forward, away from the lake, away from the life I had left behind. With every step I took, the weight of the past seemed to fall further away, and a strange sense of peace settled over me. I wasn't running anymore. I was choosing to leave, choosing to carve out something new for myself. Beside me, the creature moved silently, its long limbs gliding over the ground without a sound. Its presence no longer unnerved me. In fact, I found comfort in it. It was a part of me now, inseparable from my own being. We had gone through the fire together, faced the darkest parts of my life, and emerged on the other side stronger than I had ever thought possible. I glanced at the creature as we walked, marveling at its strange, alien grace. Its pale, sinewy form glistened in the faint light of the moon, its eyeless face turned forward, always in tune with my movements. There was an eerie beauty in the way it moved, the way it mirrored me, like we were bound by some invisible thread. I didn't need to speak for it to understand me. It felt everything I felt, understood everything I thought. We were connected, deeper than I had ever been with anyone before. That thought sent a shiver down my spine, not one of fear, but of realization. I had never truly known connection before. Not with Frank, not with anyone. My life had been filled with isolation, first from my family and then from my husband. I had spent years trying to disappear, trying to make myself small so that I wouldn't draw Frank's anger. I had let myself become invisible, shrinking further and further into the background of my own life. But the creature had changed all of that. It had come from inside me, born from my anger, my pain, my helplessness. It had given form to the things I had buried deep, the emotions I had refused to let myself feel. And now, it was with me, a constant reminder that I didn't have to be small anymore. I didn't have to hide. I had faced my worst fear, Frank, and not only had I survived, but I had won. The creature had shown me my own strength, my own capability for power, and that knowledge had fundamentally changed me. I was no longer the woman who cowered in the corner, waiting for the next blow. I was something else now, something stronger, fiercer. And the creature, my dark reflection, was a part of that transformation. The bond we shared wasn't something I could fully explain, but I felt it in every fiber of my being. It wasn't just a monster that had crawled out of my nightmares. It was me. It was the embodiment of everything I had kept hidden, everything I had been too afraid to embrace. And now that it was here, I couldn't imagine my life without it. As we walked through the night, the air cool against my skin, I found myself reflecting on what came next. I had no plan, no map to follow, but I wasn't afraid of the future. The fear that had once held me captive was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence I hadn't known I possessed. I had taken control of my life, and now the world was wide open in front of me. I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. The town, the lake, the memories, they were behind me now, like a distant echo that no longer had any power over me. The lake had been my prison once, but now it was just a place I had passed through on my way to something greater. I didn't know where the road would lead, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't alone. The creature and I moved in sync, our steps matching as if we were part of the same being. And in a way, we were. It was as much a part of me as my own heartbeat, and I could feel its strength radiating through me. Together, we were unstoppable. The world had tried to break me, to bend me to its will, but I had come out the other side unscathed. I had endured the worst of it, and now I was free. Free to make my own choices, free to live on my own terms. And with the creature by my side, I knew that nothing could stand in my way. The road ahead was dark, but I didn't fear the darkness. I had faced it before, and now it was my companion. The creature was the darkness, and I had embraced it fully. Together, we would move through the shadows, forging a new path, a new life, one where I wasn't a victim, but a force to be reckoned with. I didn't know where we were going, but that didn't matter. I had spent so long trapped in a life I didn't want, in a body that felt too small for the rage and strength I carried inside. But now, that life was behind me. The lake had taken Frank, and with him, all the pain and fears that had weighed me down. As the night stretched on and the stars blinked overhead, I felt lighter, freer than I had ever been. I didn't need a destination, only the knowledge that wherever I went, I would go as the person I had always been meant to be, strong, unafraid, and fully in control of my own destiny. The creature moved beside me, its presence a quiet reassurance, and together, we walked into the unknown. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly alive. We were free, and the world would never cage us again. Wherever we went next, we would go together. Unstoppable.